Snow fell heavy across the Dakota plains that winter. A silence so deep it swallowed the sound of footsteps and left the world in a hushed stillness. The old cabins creaked under the weight of frost. Smoke curled faintly from chimneys, and men in weathered coats passed through muddy paths carved between rough-hewn log homes. Life in the village moved slowly, shaped by the biting wind, the long nights, the stubborn hearts that refused to give in to the wilderness. It was a place caught between two worlds, the fading echoes of the Lakota, who once roamed free across endless prairies, and the relentless push of settlers building their futures on stolen soil. Among the people, there lived a warrior, known not for the battles he fought, but for the way he carried silence on his shoulders. His hair, once dark as a raven's wing, now carried strands of silver. His face bore the map of time, each line carved deep by winters of loss, wars fought and dreams buried. Many said he was a relic of an older time, a man too proud to bow but too weary to keep fighting. He had given his years to the tribe, to defending his people, and to watching the world change in ways he could not stop. Love, he often said, had no place left for him. "I am too old for such things," he would mutter, when asked why he walked alone. But fate, as it often does, wove another thread into his life. In the neighboring settlement lived a woman with eyes that seemed always fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something that had not yet come. She carried herself with quiet strength, her hands scarred by work, her spirit scarred by years of loneliness. She was not young by the measure of village gossip, and whispers often brushed against her like thorns. Why she had not married, why she chose solitude, why her gaze often wandered toward the forest trails where the Lakota still moved like shadows. Yet she carried no shame. Her heart had always belonged to a dream she had never spoken aloud, a dream that had kept her from settling for less than the love she had imagined since girlhood, the first time she saw him. It was not in battle or celebration, but in the softest of moments, no drifting between them as he led a horse through the trading post. His steps slow, his eyes low, his presence like a storm long spent. He did not notice her at first. Why would he? She was just another face among many. But she noticed him, and her heart, which had waited in silence for so long, stirred like embers coaxed back to flame. Seasons passed, and their paths crossed again and again. At the well, at the market, at the edge of the woods where hunters traded pelts. Words were few, glances were brief, but something unspoken passed between them, like a secret carried on the wind. Still, he held back, retreating into the fortress of his years, convinced love was a door closed long ago. And still, she waited. Knowing patience was the only language he would understand, the village itself was no stranger to tension. Old wounds lingered between the settlers and the Lakota, even as trade bound them together. There were nights when drums echoed across the valley, and other nights when gunfire cracked in the distance. Suspicion lived in every handshake, every bargain, every shared glance between the two worlds. Yet in that fragile space between distrust and survival, two hearts found themselves drawn closer. As if daring to cross boundaries no one else would, the people around them whispered. Some said the warrior had lost his mind, others said the woman was foolish. But neither cared much for gossip, for they knew what the others did not, that the loneliness they carried was heavier than any rumor. She saw not just the scars on his skin, but the sorrow buried behind his silence. And though he told himself he was too old for love, her presence made him question the truth of his own words. On one quiet evening, when snow again fell thick as wool and the wind rattled through the shutters, they found themselves standing face to face outside the cabin. The air between them burned with words unspoken. He looked at her, his eyes steady but weary, and said in a voice almost broken, "I am too old for love." For a moment she only watched him, snow catching in her hair, her breath rising in pale clouds. Then, with a whisper that seemed to pierce the silence of the whole village, she said, "I have waited my whole life for you." Those words hung between them, trembling like the last leaf on a winter tree. He wanted to turn away, to retreat into the comfort of solitude. But something inside him shifted, something he thought long buried. For the first time in many years, his heart beat not with regret, but with possibility. Yet love, in that time and place, was never simple. Around them lay the heavy shadow of war, the clash of two worlds unwilling to bend. Her people and his people looked at each other with suspicion. And to choose each other meant to defy more than loneliness. Sit meant to defy the world itself. He knew this. She knew this. Still, neither looked away. The snow fell harder, muffling the sounds of the village, cloaking the world in silence. He reached out as if to touch her hand, but stopped short, caught between desire and fear. And she, with eyes that burned like a lantern in the storm, waited for him to decide. The night did not give them answers. Only questions. Only the pull of hearts long denied. Only the promise of something both dangerous and beautiful. Something that could break them more, save them. And as the wind howled through the timbers and the firelight flickered in the cabin windows, the story of the Lakota warrior and the woman who had waited her whole life for him had only just begun. Would love be strong enough to bridge two worlds divided? Or would it vanish like smoke against the endless Dakota sky? The answer, as the snow swallowed their footprints, remained hidden in the night. The snowstorm carried on through the night, burying the small village in silence as if the land itself wanted to press down on every whisper and every secret. Inside cabins, lanterns glowed faintly, voices of families rose and fell, and fires cracked against the chill. Yet for the warrior and the woman who had found themselves standing face to face in the falling snow, sleep did not come easily. His words, "I am too old for love," and hers, "I have waited my whole life for," you had left the air heavy with something neither of them could escape. He returned to his lodge, where a fire burned low, the smell of cedar smoke weaving through the air. He sat alone, his hands resting on his knees, staring into the flames as if searching for answers. He had lived through battles where steel met flesh, winters that took the young and the strong, treaties broken by men in dark coats with pens sharp as knives. Love, he told himself, belonged to the young or the foolish. Yet her eyes haunted him, filled with something he could not name, hope, perhaps, or a quiet promise he thought no longer existed. She, in her own cabin, sat by the window, watching the snow drift against the glass. She had spoken boldly, more boldly than she had ever spoken in her life, and now her heart raced with both fear and longing. What if he turned away? What if her words had pressed too hard against a wound he wanted left closed? But another part of her, stubborn, unyielding, whispered that the moment had been true, that he had heard her not with his ears but with his heart. As the days passed, the rhythm of the village carried on. Men chopped wood, women tended fires, children ran laughing through the snow. Yet beneath the ordinary tasks, there lingered an unease, not only between the warrior and the woman, but among the people themselves. The settlers looked at the Lakota with wary eyes, fearing their silence more than their words. The Lakota, in turn, watched the settlers' cabins rise, where once the tall grass bent in the wind. Each plank a reminder of land taken and freedom shrinking. The air between the two worlds was thick with suspicion. Yet trade and survival bound them together. It was in these uneasy exchanges that the warrior often crossed paths with her again. At the market where venison hung from hooks and jars of honey-lined tables, he would see her. She would nod, a faint smile on her lips, but he rarely returned it. His heart wanted to, but his pride and fear held him back. Still, her presence unsettled him in a way no battle ever had. The elders of his people watched him carefully. They remembered him as the young warrior who once rode at the front, his bow drawn, his spirit fierce. They whispered that he carried too much sorrow, that he walked in the shadow of the past instead of the light of the present. Some urged him to speak with her, to listen to what the Great Spirit had placed in his path. Others warned that her world was not his, that love across such a divide could only bring more pain. He listened to them all, but in the end he listened only to the silence of his own heart, which told him nothing clear. For her, the struggle was no easier. The other women in the village spoke of her behind closed doors, saying she was chasing a ghost. No good could come from yearning for a man who carried the weight of another world on his shoulders. But she ignored their whispers. She had always felt different, as if her heart had been waiting for something beyond what others accepted as life. She saw in him not just age and sorrow, but the strength of a man who had endured when others had fallen. She saw in him the echo of a story unfinished. As winter pressed on, tensions between the settlers and the Lakota sharpened. A horse went missing from one cabin, and fingers were pointed toward the Lakota hunters. A line of traps was found cut along the river, and suspicion fell on the settlers. Small incidents grew into heated words, and heated words threatened to become fire. The warrior knew too well what such sparks could become. He had seen villages burned, families broken, and peace shattered like glass. He wanted no part of it, yet he also knew he could not turn away if his people were threatened. It was during one of these tense nights, when voices clashed in the town square, that she saw him again. He stood at the edge, his face calm, but his presence commanding. And when her eyes met his, it felt as though the noise of the crowd dimmed. For a moment, the world was only the two of them, bound by something stronger than fear. She wanted to go to him, to stand at his side, but the stares of the people held her back. Later, when the crowd dispersed and the fires burned low, she found him walking the snowy trail beyond the cabins. The moonlight silvered the trees, and the night was quiet except for the crunch of their steps. She followed until he turned, his face half-shadowed. "Half-lit, you should not be here," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed something softer. "Neither should you," she answered. "But here we are." He studied her, the stubborn line of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. She did not flinch under his gaze, did not bow her head. Instead, she held herself as though she belonged beside him, as though the years between them and the distance of their worlds meant nothing. "I told you," he said at last. "I am too old for such things." "And I told you," she whispered. "I have waited my whole life for you." His breath caught, though he did not show it. For a long moment, neither spoke. The night stretched around them, the trees creaked, and the snow fell softer now, like a blessing. He wanted to reach for her hand, but again, fear stopped him. Fear of what the world would say, fear of what the future might demand, fear of hope itself. She waited. But when he said nothing more, she turned to leave. And yet as she walked away, his voice followed her into the night. "You do not know the weight of what you ask?" he said. She stopped, her back to him, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned her head and met his eyes once more. "Then let me carry it with you." The words cut through him like no weapon ever had. He stood there, rooted in the snow, as she walked back toward the village lights. He did not follow, but he also did not forget. That night, sleep escaped him. He dreamed of the past, of battles and losses, of faces he could not save. And among them now, like a light flickering against the darkness, he dreamed of her. Her voice echoed through the storm, steady and unyielding. "I have waited my whole life for you." When dawn came, he rose before the sun, as he always did. But something had shifted in him. The world felt both heavier and brighter. He knew he could not ignore her words, nor his own heart, no matter how much he wanted to bury it in silence. Yet as the village stirred awake, and as the shadows of conflict thickened between settlers and Lakota, he also knew this love, if it came, would not come easily. It would demand of him something greater than battle, something greater than pride. It would demand surrender. That was a thing he had never learned to give. The story of them both was no longer just a whisper. It had become a flame, fragile but growing. And in a land where fire could both warm and destroy, its end was still unwritten. The winter deepened, and with it, the silence between the warrior and the woman grew heavier, though never empty. Every time their paths crossed, it was as if the air thickened with things unsaid. The village itself seemed to sense it, as though their unspoken bond carried weight beyond themselves. But there was no time for softness in those weeks. The land and the people were bracing for storms of another kind. The settlers grew restless. Supplies ran thin as the snow kept wagons from reaching the town. Men argued at the trading post, their tempers sharp as the knives they carried at their belts. A missing horse turned into an accusation into a near brawl. The Lakota, who hunted deeper into the woods to keep their families fed, found themselves watched more closely, their every movement measured through suspicion. The warrior felt it keenly. He had lived long enough to know that hunger and fear made men reckless. The woman, too, felt the shift. When she walked to the well, she heard whispers follow her about her solitary life, about her glances toward the man the settlers distrusted. Some said she was foolish, others cruel to herself, waiting for someone who would never take her hand. Yet she ignored them. She knew their words came from fear, the same fear that clung to the town like frost on glass. One evening, a meeting was called in the square. Men gathered with torches, their voices echoing off the frozen logs of cabins. They spoke of the stolen horse, of traps destroyed, of shadows in the woods. Some demanded retribution, others urged caution. The warrior stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms folded, listening as accusations swelled. He knew too well where such anger could lead. He had seen it before, when one small flame became a wildfire. It was then the woman saw him again, his figure steady in the torchlight, his eyes calm but his jaw set. She knew he was thinking what she was, that the fragile peace was about to break. She wanted to stand beside him, to remind him he was not alone, but fear of the crowd's eyes kept her back. Instead, she watched him slip away into the night, a shadow among shadows. The days that followed were restless. The settlers formed patrols, riding the outskirts of the village with rifles across their laps. The Lakota grew quieter, retreating deeper into the woods, watching with wary eyes. The warrior found himself caught between worlds. Too old to ride with the hot-blooded young men who wanted to prove themselves, too proud to kneel before the settlers, who saw him only as an enemy. He walked alone, carrying the burden of both silence and memory. The woman, sensing the storm building, sought him out. She found him one evening near the river, the water frozen over, the sky painted with streaks of fading red. He stood still, his breath rising in pale clouds, his thoughts far away. She approached quietly, her steps crunching in the snow. And for a moment he did not turn. "You carry too much alone," she said softly. He glanced at her, his eyes dark, unreadable. "It is the way of my people, the way of old men." "You are not just an old man," she answered. "You are more than you want to admit." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What you want? It is not simple. To walk together means to fight against more than hunger or cold. It means to fight against two worlds that do not wish to see us side by side." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "Then let them look. Let them speak. I have lived long enough in silence. I will not hide from truth." Her words struck him, but he did not answer. Instead, he walked past her, leaving her in the fading light, her heart aching, but her resolve unshaken. Meanwhile, whispers grew louder in both camps. Among the settlers, a young man, broad-shouldered, brashed stirred anger, saying the Lakota planned to strike when supplies ran out. Among the Lakota, young warriors muttered that the settlers were preparing to drive them from the woods. Suspicion became firewood, each rumor another spark. The warrior tried to speak to the younger men of his people, urging patience, but they dismissed him as one who had grown weak with years. The woman, too, faced a storm of her own. The same young settler who roused anger also began to follow her with his eyes, his pride wounded by her indifference. He asked questions, others whispered, why she wasted her youth waiting. She lingered near the one man the village mistrusted most. She answered him with silence, but his stare grew heavier, his words sharper. She knew trouble when she saw it, and she sensed his heart carried both envy and spite. As the conflict sharpened, the land itself seemed to tighten. Wolves came closer to the cabins at night, driven by hunger. The river ice groaned under weight, threatening to break. Even the trees seemed to whisper of change, their branches heavy with snow, but bending toward spring that felt impossibly far. The warrior spent long nights awake, listening to the wind, his spirit torn between past and present. He thought of the battles he had fought, the lives lost, the women who once sang for the warriors who never returned. He thought of her words, "I have waited my whole life for you," and wondered if he had the strength to answer them. One night, as the wind howled against the shutters, she came to his door. She stood there, breathless from the cold, her cheeks flushed. He opened the door, startled. his eyes narrowing with both concern and confusion. "There are men speaking against you," she said quickly. "They say you are the one guiding the hunters to steal from the traps. They say you plan to turn the young men against the village." His jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. "And do you believe them?" Her eyes held his. "I know your heart. I believe nothing of it." For the first time, his expression softened. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths, until finally he stepped aside and let her in. The fire inside burned low, its glow casting shadows across the walls. She stood close, her hands trembling slightly, and for a moment they simply looked at one another. But before words could come, a sound split the night, the crack of gunfire in the distance, sharp and cold. Both froze, their hearts pounding. He reached for his bow, still leaning by the door, his body moving with instinct, and she followed him outside. The night was alive with echoes, men shouting, dogs barking, firelight flickering against the snow. In the distance, torches moved like angry stars, weaving through the trees. The settlers had taken to the woods, and the Lakota were not far behind. The fragile thread of peace was unraveling before their eyes. He turned to her, his face grave. "Go back. Stay inside." But she shook her head. "No, not this time." There was no more time to argue. The night had come alive with fear, and the storm that both had felt building was no longer waiting at the horizon. It was here. They moved toward the sound together. Their footsteps swallowed by snow, their breath sharp in the cold air. Around them, the village was no longer quiet, no longer safe. The world they both knew was shifting, pulling them into a conflict neither could stop. But both would have to face. The warrior's heart was heavy with memory. The woman's heart steady with resolve, and between them lay not just love, but the fire of a story larger than themselves. The night ahead held no promise of peace, only the echo of gunfire and the weight of choices yet to come. And in that dark, cold silence between shots, both knew this: their lives would never again return to what they had been before. The torches cut through the forest like angry eyes, their light bouncing off the frozen branches, making every shadow seem alive. Shouts rang through the cold night, settlers calling to one another as they moved toward the edge of the woods. The woman gripped her shawl tighter, her breath shaking in the bitter air, while the warrior walked ahead, his bow in hand, his body tense as a drawn string. Neither spoke. Words had no place when the night itself felt ready to break open. A rifle cracked again in the distance, echoing through the trees. The sound tore through the silence like lightning splitting the sky. Somewhere to the north, a dog barked furiously, and then another joined. The settlers were moving in a line, searching, hunting, convinced the missing horse and traps were part of something greater. The warrior knew they were chasing shadows, but fear once set loose was harder to stop than fire on dry grass. The woman struggled to keep up with his long stride, but she did not fall back. Her eyes followed every flicker of light, every sound in the darkness. And though fear pressed against her chest, she stayed close. The warrior glanced at her once, his eyes hard, but he did not tell her to leave. He understood now she would not turn away. Part of him no longer wanted her to. In the clearing near the frozen river, voices clashed. A group of young Lakota stood in the snow, their spears raised, their faces lit by torchlight. Across from them, settlers gripped rifles, their coats stiff with frost. Between the two sides stretched a space fragile as glass. One word, one wrong step, would shatter it. The warrior stepped forward, his presence cutting through the noise. He lifted his hand, his voice steady but firm. "No blood tonight," he called. The words carrying across the clearing, but the young men on both sides burned with pride and fear. A settler shouted that his traps had been stolen. A Lakota youth answered with anger that the land itself had been stolen first. The woman's heart pounded as the voices rose higher, sharper, like knives scraped against stone. The warrior moved slowly into the open, his bow lowered, but his body strong. The settlers shifted uneasily, some recognizing him, others narrowing their eyes in distrust. The Lakota youths looked at him with both respect and impatience. To them, he was the past, cautious when they wanted action. He raised his hand again, but before he could speak further, the brash young settler who had long followed the woman with his jealous eyes stepped forward. His torch flared bright against the night as he pointed toward the warrior. "There he is!" the young man shouted, his voice ringing with fury. "He is the one behind all of this. He hides in the woods and sets his people against us. He waits for us to starve so he can claim what's left." The crowd shifted, eyes turning toward the warrior. The woman felt a chill deeper than the snow run through her. She wanted to scream that it wasn't true, but her voice caught in her throat. The warrior stood unmoving, his face unreadable. Though his heart burned with the weight of the accusation, the Lakota youths bristled, spears tightening in their hands. One stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You lie." "He is a man of honor," the settler sneered. "Honor. He is a shadow waiting for his moment." He looked toward the woman then, his eyes glinting. "And why do you defend him with your silence? What spell has he put on you?" Her cheeks flushed with heat, but she did not lower her gaze. She stepped forward, her voice clear. "He has put no spell on me. I know him. He carries no lies. You, who speak of shadows, are the one who spreads fear." The crowd rippled, whispers breaking out like dry leaves in wind. The settler's face darkened, his pride wounded before so many eyes. He lifted his rifle, not quite aiming, but the motion itself made the clearing tighten like a noose. The warrior's hand moved fast. His bow raised, though no arrow was drawn. His voice thundered, sharper than the crack of rifles. Enough. The sound stilled both sides, if only for a heartbeat. The warrior's eyes swept the clearing, his voice carrying the weight of years of battles fought and lives lost. "Do you not see what you are doing? The snow is deep, the hunger grows, and yet you fight each other instead of the winter that will kill us all. You look for an enemy, but the enemy is the cold, the hunger, the silence of the earth when it gives nothing." For a moment, silence fell. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The woman looked at him, her heart swelling with both fear and pride. She had never seen him speak so openly, so fiercely, not only for his people, but for all. But the young settler's pride would not bend. His hand tightened on the rifle, his voice sharp with rage. "Words will not feed us. Words will not return what's been stolen." And then, in the edge of the clearing, a torch fell, its fire licking at the dry brush. Flames sprang up, wild and sudden, casting the snow in orange light. The settlers shouted, pulling back, while the Lakota youths raised their weapons higher. The fragile thread had begun to tear. The warrior stepped toward the fire, his voice rising again. "Put it out. Do not let it spread." But few listened. The flames crackled, sparks flying into the night, and in the chaos, the sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the noise. The woman's breath caught as she saw the young settler's finger hover near the trigger. His eyes fixed on the warrior. Time seemed to slow. She moved without thought, stepping closer to the warrior, her body trembling, her voice breaking through the chaos. "Don't," she cried out. "This will not end the way you think." But the young man's face was twisted with something darker than anger and fear and a need to prove himself before all. His hands shook, but his finger did not loosen. The Lakota youths braced, their spears ready. The settlers lifted their rifles higher. Torches flared, fire spread, and the night filled with smoke. Every heartbeat felt like the last moment before the storm broke fully. The warrior looked at the woman, his eyes filled with a weight she could barely hold. Then he stepped forward, placing himself between her and the raised rifle. His voice, calm yet unyielding, rang out once more. "If blood must fall tonight, let it be mine." Gasps rose from both sides. The young settler's hand trembled harder, caught between his pride and the eyes of the crowd. The fire hissed as snow fell into its edges, the smoke curling into the night. The air was thick with fear, hope, something deeper neither side could yet name. The woman's heart pounded as she reached for the warrior's arm, her fingers clutching his sleeve as though she could anchor him against what was coming. Her whisper was barely heard, but it carried into him. "You are not alone." The crackle of the fire grew louder. The silence stretched, unbearable, As rifle barrels gleamed, spears glinted, and breath rose in clouds against the frozen sky. All waited. Every soul in that clearing caught between a single heartbeat and the storm about to break, and then the night held still, teetering on the edge of a choice that would decide everything. The night held its breath, every face caught in the glow of firelight, every heart waiting for the sound of a gunshot. The warrior stood tall, his chest steady, his shadow stretching across the snow like a shield between the two sides. The woman's hand clutched his sleeve, her eyes locked on the young settler, whose finger hovered on the trigger. The flames hissed, the torches flickered, and it seemed as if the world itself leaned forward, waiting to see which way the balance would fall. Then a cry rose from the edge of the woods. A boy, no more than 10 winters old, stumbled into the clearing, his face pale with fear. "The barn," he shouted, pointing behind him. "The fire has spread to the barn." All eyes turned. Beyond the tree line, smoke rose against the sky, orange sparks lifting into the night. The settlers gasped inside that barn were the few stores of grain and dried meat meant to carry them through the winter. Without it, hunger would be certain. The young settler froze, his rifle still raised, but his eyes darted toward the rising flames. His hand wavered. The warrior stepped forward, lowering his bow completely, his voice calm but strong. "You can fight me, or you can fight the fire. Choose now." The silence broke, at last. One by one, men dropped their weapons and turned toward the burning barn. Settlers ran with buckets, shouting to one another, their anger forgotten in the face of survival. Even the Lakota youths lowered their spears, torn between pride and the urgency of the moment. The warrior turned to them, his voice sharp. "Help them. If the food burns, no one lives. Not them, not us." The young men hesitated, their eyes uncertain. But the warrior's authority, born from years of battles and scars, carried weight. Slowly, they moved, joining the settlers as they ran toward the barn. Together, they formed a line to the river, passing buckets of icy water from hand to hand. The woman stood close to the warrior as he bent to take a bucket, his muscles straining as he threw water onto the flames. The fire roared, defiant, but the combined effort of both sides pressed against it. Snow melted under their boots, smoke stung their eyes, and the night filled with coughing and shouts. For hours, the fight raged not between men, but against the blaze that threatened to take everything at last. As dawn began to creep pale across the horizon, the flames hissed and died, leaving only blackened beams and smoke curling into the morning sky. Exhausted, men collapsed in the snow, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Women brought water and blankets. Children wept with relief, and for a moment, there was no division between settler and Lakota-only people who had fought the same battle side by side. The warrior stood apart, his chest heaving, his face streaked with ash. The woman approached, her eyes shining with both exhaustion and pride. She touched his arm gently. "You saved them," she whispered. He shook his head, his voice low. "We saved ourselves. Alone, none of us would have stopped it." In the crowd, the young settler who had nearly pulled the trigger stood silent, his rifle now hanging useless at his side. His pride had been cracked open by the fire, and though his eyes still carried resentment, there was also shame. He turned away, unable to meet the warrior's gaze, disappeared into the weary group of men. In the days that followed, something shifted in the village. The fire had burned away more than what it had burned away some of the fear and suspicion. Settlers and Lakota, though still wary, began to trade more openly, to share the burden of cutting wood and hauling water. Children played together in the snow, their laughter rising above the wounds of the past. The scars of mistrust were not gone, but a fragile seed of respect had taken root. For the woman, the whispers that had once followed her quieted. People who had once doubted her now looked at her differently, remembering how she had stood firm in the clearing. She had spoken when others held their tongues, and though not all approved, some now admired her courage. The warrior, too, found himself looked at in a new way. Where once he had been seen as a relic of the past, a shadow too heavy with years, He was now seen as a man who had bridged two worlds when no one else dared. Young men who had once dismissed him now listened when he spoke. Settlers who had once feared him now nodded in passing. Yet for him, the greatest change came not from their eyes, but from his own heart. He had carried sorrow for so long, believing himself too old for love, too worn for new beginnings. But the fire had shown him that even an old warrior could still stand, still matter, still love. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he walked to the woman's cabin. She sat by the window, the light of the fire glowing behind her, her hands busy with mending. When she looked up and saw him, she smiled faintly, as though she had been waiting all along. He stepped inside, his voice quiet but sure. "I once told you I was too old for love." Her eyes softened. I remember he moved closer, his gaze steady on hers. "But you were right. You waited your whole life, and I—" His voice faltered, but he did not look away. "I will not make you wait longer." Tears welled in her eyes, though her smile grew. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. In that moment, the years between them, the suspicions of the village, the weight of the pastel of it fell away. What remained was something simple, steady, and true. Seasons passed, and the memory of that night of fire lingered in the village. People spoke of how enemies had fought side by side, how the snow had melted under the weight of unity. Children grew hearing the story, learning that survival had not come from pride or anger, but from standing together. The warrior and the woman walked those years side by side, their bond a quiet proof that even in a land scarred by conflict, love could grow like wildflowers in spring. He grew older still, his hair white, his steps slower, but his heart lighter than it had been in decades. She, too, carried her years with grace, her strength steady, her eyes still filled with the fire that had first called to him. When he looked back on his life, on the battles fought and the scars carried, he no longer thought only of loss. He thought of that night when he had stood between two sides, ready to tear each other apart, and of the voice that had whispered in the darkness, "You are not alone," and in the quiet of the plains, where the wind still carried the songs of both past and future. Their story lived on not as a tale of war or suspicion, but as a reminder that love, even when it comes late, can change more than just two hearts. It can change the course of a whole village, a whole people, perhaps even the world beyond. The snow fell gently one last time that winter, soft and quiet, covering the scars of fire and footsteps alike. And in that silence, the warrior and the woman sat together, watching the flakes drift, their hands entwined, knowing at last that they had both found what they had been waiting for all their lives.